Welcome to the debate. Today, we are analyzing the multidimensional framework of service quality management, which I know sounds a bit dense, but if we really look at how the modern economy functions, it becomes pretty apparent that assessing the quality of a service is, well, an entirely different intellectual and operational beast than assessing the quality of a physical product.
Oh, absolutely. Because you can't just, put a haircut on an assembly line.
Right. Unlike building a smartphone or manufacturing a car, where you can test the item 100 times, measure its tolerances, and verify it's perfect before a consumer ever touches it, services just don't work that way. They are fundamentally fragile because they are intangible, they are produced and consumed at the exact same time, and most importantly, they are profoundly influenced by customer perception in real time. The product essentially is the experience itself.
Exactly. And because of that simultaneous production and consumption, you can't just recall a bad haircut or a rude waiter the way you can recall a defective toaster. The moment happens, and then it's gone. Based on the foundational literature of service operations, we understand there are essentially three major elements that interact to shape a customer's perception of quality. You have your information, which is the data and communication supporting the delivery. You have the explicit services, which are the measurable, observable, tangible aspects. And finally, you have the implicit services, which are the psychological, emotional, and highly subjective experiences the customer perceives.
The complexity of managing those three pillars really cannot be overstated because they never operate in isolation. Whenever an organization attempts to design or optimize a service system, managers are forced to make hard choices. They have to allocate resources, budget, attention across these dimensions, which brings us to the core tension we are exploring today. When organizations design and manage these massive, complex service systems, what is the ultimate driver of customer perception and competitive advantage? Is it the measurable operational core, specifically the explicit services and the information systems? Or is it the psychological, emotional experience derived from implicit services? I will argue that explicit services and information flows form the indispensable, measurable foundation that dictates operational success, reliability, and ultimately service quality.
And I will argue that while the explicit and informational elements are absolutely necessary baselines, the implicit services, those subjective psychological dimensions, are the true differentiators that ultimately govern a human being's perception of quality.
Okay, so if we want to figure out what actually drives service quality, I think we have to start with what we can actually manage. We have to ground our understanding in operational reality. Explicit services represent the tangible, measurable aspects of what a customer receives. Alongside service information, the data and communication that enable the delivery. These explicit factors simply must be the primary focus of any successful organization. Why? Because of a fundamental axiom of management. You can only optimize what you can effectively measure and track.
Right, the hard metrics.
Exactly. Explicit services give you empirical data. Managers can track service time, they can measure error rates, they track capacity utilization, meaning how many tables are actually full in a restaurant on a Friday night, or how many seats are booked on a flight. They ensure availability. Think about an airline. The explicit service is flight punctuality, baggage handling accuracy, seat dimensions. Think of a restaurant where the explicit elements are the temperature of the food, the accuracy of the orders, the exact wait time for a table. These are objective, undeniable metrics.
Sure, but
If an airline cannot get its planes off the ground on time, or if a restaurant consistently burns its food and drops the wrong plates at your table, the entire service system collapses. In those scenarios of explicit failure, any effort you poured into the emotional or psychological atmosphere becomes entirely irrelevant. The foundation of service quality is inherently operational. Without that mathematically measurable foundation, there is no service to speak of. You just have a nice conversation in a room where nothing works.
That is a highly rational systems engineering approach to the problem. But I think it misses the fundamental reality of human consumption. Let us be clear, no one is suggesting that an airline should ignore flight schedules or that a restaurant shouldn't care if the food is inedible. Explicit performance is a baseline necessity. It is the minimum viable requirement to even participate in the market. But it is fundamentally insufficient for creating what we call perceived quality, because services are consumed and evaluated subjectively by highly irrational human beings. The implicit services dictate the final evaluation.
But subjective evaluation still requires a functional baseline.
It requires it, but it doesn't judge the quality by it. We are talking about the customer feeling welcomed. We are talking about them having profound trust in the organization, feeling a sense of safety, perceiving a high level of professionalism. An organization can engineer a mathematically perfect explicit service. You can have a flight that pushes back from the gate exactly to the minute. You can have a hotel room that meets every single microscopic sanitation standard. But if the implicit emotional experience is poor, say the flight attendant is visibly annoyed when you ask for water, or the hotel front desk agent makes you feel like an inconvenience, the customer will still perceive that service as low quality. The human mind does not evaluate a service like a spreadsheet. It evaluates it as an emotional narrative. Therefore, the true value and the ultimate driver of competitive advantage lies in those unquantifiable, subjective human elements.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. When we look at how modern service systems have evolved, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, with the advent of massive digital platforms, we actually see that the information flow has become the absolute dominant force in shaping that customer perception you're talking about. Consider platforms like Uber, Airbnb, or Amazon. Let's take Uber as a case study. In the case of a rideshare, the ride itself, moving from point A to point B, is the explicit service. But what actually revolutionized the industry and drove the perception of high quality, it wasn't the implicit friendliness of the drivers. Cabbies could be friendly. It was the robust information system.
You're talking about the app interface.
I'm talking about the entire data ecosystem. It is the real-time driver location tracking on the map. It is the precise estimated arrival time. It's the digital payment interface where you don't have to fumble for cash. And it's the aggregate customer reviews. Without those information systems constantly feeding data to the consumer, the service immediately feels unreliable. Have you ever ordered a car on a less sophisticated app where the car just freezes on the map?
Oh, I have. It's incredibly stressful.
Exactly. Even if the driver is friendly and even if the car is clean, the moment that information flow breaks down, your anxiety spikes. The data reduces uncertainty. It eliminates anxiety. The information flow is now as critical as the physical service itself, and that proves that hard data and measurable systems are what drive modern service quality. The psychological state of the consumer is actually managed by the explicit information system, not just a vague sense of interpersonal atmosphere.
I come at it from a different way. I fully acknowledge that the information systems in companies like Uber and Airbnb are highly sophisticated and critically important to their scale, but we have to ask, what is that information actually doing in the mind of the consumer? It is merely setting expectations and creating a scaffolding for the experience. The information system does not replace the implicit experience. It is completely subservient to it. Let's stick with the Uber example you just raised. You can have perfect trip tracking on your phone. You can have a flawless digital payment interface that never glitches and an estimated arrival time that is accurate to the exact second. But think about what happens when the customer actually opens the car door.
They receive the explicit service they contracted for.
But how do they experience it? What if they get into that car and it smells faintly of stale cigarette smoke and the driver gives them a look that makes them feel immediately unwelcome? Or what if the driver is accelerating too aggressively, not technically breaking the speed limit, so the explicit metric of moving toward the destination safely is technically met, but the passenger's sense of safety is compromised? If they feel uncomfortable or if they lack trust in the person driving that vehicle, that perfectly engineered information system cannot save the service experience. The implicit factor of safety and trust immediately overrides the explicit data. The high-quality information you praise is completely neutralized by a poor implicit emotional experience. The digital interface might successfully get the customer to the car, but the psychological reality of the ride dictates whether they will ever open that app again.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. When you focus so heavily on the psychological experience, the vibes of the car essentially, you are ignoring the practical reality of how organizations actually ensure quality at scale. You are talking about edge cases of human behavior. Explicit services are the primary focus of management precisely because they can be systematically monitored, standardized, and improved across thousands or millions of interactions. You ensure quality by managing the measurable tangibles.
But you can't manage human emotion with a stopwatch.
No, but you manage the environment that creates the emotion. Let's look at the hotel industry. If a massive global hotel chain wants to guarantee a 5-star rating across properties in Tokyo, New York, and London, they don't just tell their staff to be friendly and make people feel safe. That's unscalable. Instead, they implement rigorous, explicit operational protocols. They mandate that the phone at the front desk must be answered within exactly 3 rings. They dictate exactly how the room must be staged, down to the millimeter placement of the pillows. They have specific, measurable cleanliness audits. These are explicit, observable elements. They track availability and capacity utilization to ensure the physical environment is flawless. You cannot build a global service organization on the highly variable, difficult-to-measure emotions of your staff and customers. You build it on standardized, measurable, explicit operational excellence. The implicit feeling of luxury is just a byproduct of perfectly executed explicit standards.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered the hotel example directly from our source material? Because the operational standardization you are praising is exactly why explicit services fail to generate true competitive advantage in the modern market. Explicit standardization is easily replicatable. Think about it. 2 hotels can exist on the exact same street in a major city. They can offer identical room sizes, identical threat count sheets, identical check-in protocols, identical amenities, and identical prices. By every explicit, measurable metric on a manager's dashboard, those 2 services are equal.
And yet, they will perform differently in the market.
Precisely. Customers will consistently perceive one hotel as vastly higher quality than the other. Why? Purely because of the implicit services. I'll give you a real-world equivalent. I was at a theoretically 5-star hotel last month for a conference. The explicit metrics were perfect. The room was spotless, the check-in took less than 3 minutes, the Wi-Fi was incredibly fast, but the front desk agent wouldn't make eye contact. The concierge seemed rushed and annoyed when I asked a simple question. The physical environment was flawlessly standardized, but it felt sterile, cold, and unwelcoming. It completely ruined the luxury illusion for me. Doesn't that prove how fragile your explicit metrics are?
I would argue that your anecdote represents a failure in training, which is still an operational variable.
But the training is aimed at the implicit experience, the elements that create real value, the staff appearing genuinely warm, the atmosphere feeling relaxing, the subtle environment feeling truly luxurious. Those create implicit value, and that value strongly influences customer perception. This is why luxury hotels, premium airlines, and high-end restaurants invest so heavily in creating strong implicit experiences. They know that explicit services, the clean sheets and the fast Wi-Fi, are just table stakes. You don't win a medal for having a clean room, you just avoid going out of business. The implicit service is the sole differentiator.
I think sole differentiator is too strong a claim.
Or the accuracy of a diagnosis is the explicit service. It is entirely objective and obviously a matter of life and death. But what does the patient actually evaluate when they leave the hospital? Most patients lack the medical expertise to judge the clinical accuracy of their treatment. I certainly don't know how to judge if a surgeon used the optimal suturing technique. Instead, I judge the doctor based on whether they looked at me, listened to me, and made me feel safe. I evaluate my trust in them. I evaluate whether I felt cared for. The implicit experience becomes the proxy by which the highly technical explicit quality is judged. If a brilliant, mathematically perfect surgeon has a terrible bedside manner, the patient will perceive the medical care as lower quality.
I understand the human tendency to do that, but relying on implicit proxies is inherently dangerous from a management perspective, and it's heavily biased by the fact that patients don't have medical degrees. If we want to look at how service quality is formally evaluated in the literature, we should look at how the industry actually measures this stuff. Let's talk about customer perception models, specifically the ServQual framework, which basically every manager uses. If you look at ServQual, it clearly highlights the dominance of operational execution.
I'm not sure ServQual supports your premise as strongly as you think it does.
Hear me out. Look at the key dimension of reliability in that framework. Reliability is defined as the ability to deliver the promised service consistently and accurately. Then look at tangibles, the physical aspects of the service environment, the equipment, the appearance of personnel. These dimensions empirically prove that delivering the explicit service accurately and backing it up with solid physical and informational evidence is the absolute bedrock of quality management. If you promise a service, you must deliver it exactly as promised. That is an operational, explicit function. All the bedside manner and hotel atmosphere in the world cannot compensate for a service that fundamentally fails to be reliable. Managers combine operational data, surveys, and reviews specifically to track this reliability, because if you aren't reliable, you don't have a business.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You have selectively chosen two dimensions of the ServQual framework that align perfectly with your operational bias while conveniently ignoring the majority of the model.
I highlighted the foundational ones.
You highlighted the explicit ones, but the ServQual framework consists of 5 dimensions. You mentioned reliability and tangibles. What are the other 3? Let's name them. They are responsiveness, which is the willingness to help customers and provide prompt service. Assurance, which is the knowledge and courtesy of employees and their ability to convey trust and confidence. And empathy, which is the caring, individualized attention the firm provides its customers. 3 of the 5 dimensions in the most widely used framework for measuring service quality are deeply, inextricably tied to the implicit experience.
But responsiveness can be measured. You can measure how fast someone responds.
You can measure the speed, but you cannot measure the willingness or the courtesy with a stopwatch. Responsiveness, assurance, and empathy cannot be coded into a reservation system. They cannot be automated by an IT department. They are psychological and emotional experiences that the customer perceives entirely through human interaction and environmental cues. The framework itself acknowledges that while you must be reliable, yes, you need your tangibles, the ultimate evaluation of quality hinges heavily on empathy and trust.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it treats empathy as this isolated, magical variable, totally divorced from the information and explicit systems that actually enable it. Let's examine a scenario of interactive failure from the source material to see how these elements actually behave under pressure. Let's take the airline industry, which we know relies heavily on all 3 components. Suppose there is a massive weather disruption. A storm rolls in. If passengers receive poor updates about their boarding status, which is fundamentally an information failure, the entire service fails. The anxiety rises, the perceived quality plummets. Why? Because the data flow is interrupted. In a crisis, the information system is what actually manages the customer's psychological state. I've been in airports during massive storms where the gate agents were totally overwhelmed, but because the airline's app was pushing real-time accurate rebooking information to my phone, my anxiety was managed. Without that operational data communicating schedules, the passenger feels entirely abandoned. The failure of the measurable information system directly dictates the poor emotional response. The implicit failure is downstream of the explicit failure.
That is a fair point about the app mitigating anxiety, but let's look at the exact specific scenario provided in the text regarding airline failures, because it perfectly illustrates my point, not yours. Let's imagine a situation where the explicit service is actually completely successful. No storm, the flight departs exactly on time, the physical, operational mandate, the hardest explicit metric an airline has been fulfilled to absolute perfection.
Okay, a successful explicit delivery.
Exactly. However, as the passengers are boarding, they feel uncomfortable because the staff appear visibly stressed, rushed, and perhaps a bit short-tempered. That is an implicit service failure. And as you mentioned in your own example, the passengers receive poor, confusing updates over the PA system about the boarding process, an informational failure. So, we have an explicit success, but implicit and informational failures. The text clearly shows that even though the core operational goal of getting the plane off the ground on time was flawlessly executed, the customers will still perceive the overall experience as poor.
because they were stressed during boarding.
Exactly. And this profoundly demonstrates my position. Explicit success guarantees absolutely nothing without implicit support. The psychological discomfort of seeing stressed staff, absorbing that negative energy, and dealing with poor communication completely overrides the on-time departure in the mind of the consumer. As they sit in their seat, flying exactly on schedule, they are thinking, I hate this airline. The operational metric was a total success, the dashboard in corporate headquarters is flashing green, but the service quality as experienced by the human being paying for it was a failure. Therefore, perception dictates reality.
I will concede that the interaction between these elements is where the true complexity lies, and your airline example highlights how quickly a perfectly good explicit delivery can be soured by bad communication. But I maintain that managers must prioritize what they can control. The stressed staff and the poor PA updates in that airline scenario are, at their root, failures of operational management and information flow. If the underlying information systems were robust, the communication would have been automated and clear, alleviating both the passengers' anxiety and the staff's stress. The staff were likely stressed because the operational system was failing them. Successful organizations must be built on the measurable operational efficiency of explicit and information services. Those are the levers that management can actually pull. You can upgrade a reservation system. You can refine a digital interface to be more intuitive.
You can mandate cleanliness standards and track them with operational data. That empirical foundation is what allows a service to scale, to be reliable, and to survive in a fiercely competitive marketplace.
And I maintain that while you are pulling those operational levers, you must never forget that customer perception and emotional experience ultimately define your service quality. That makes implicit services the paramount concern. Yes, managers must track operational data, but they must deeply understand that service quality is not merely operational efficiency. Efficiency is for robots. Service quality is entirely about how that efficiency is experienced by a human being. A luxury hotel, a premium healthcare provider, a highly rated Airbnb host, they all succeed at the highest levels because they master the unquantifiable art of making the customer feel valued, safe, and trusting. The explicit and informational components are incredibly important. They are the stage, the lighting, and the script. But the implicit experience is the actual performance. And if the implicit emotional connection fails, the entire service system fails in the eyes of the consumer, regardless of what the internal performance dashboards and capacity utilization spreadsheets say.
What is incredibly clear from our discussion today, and deeply embedded in the source material we've been analyzing, is that service quality is genuinely multidimensional. A service can and will fail if any single element, information explicit or implicit, is weak. The reality is that modern organizations simply cannot afford the luxury of choosing between operational efficiency and emotional resonance. They are required to manage all three components simultaneously, in real time rather than in isolation. The digital interface must be precise, the physical environment must be flawless, and the human interaction must be empathetic.
Exactly. And that highlights just how incredibly challenging it is for organizations to manage service systems. It requires a delicate, constant, almost artistic balancing act between hard operational data like wait times and error rates and the deeply nuanced, subjective world of human emotion and perception. Designing a service that integrates all three of these components seamlessly without one overpowering or undermining the other is arguably one of the most difficult tasks in modern business.
There are certainly many more layers to explore within service quality frameworks, customer perception models, and how different industries, from banking to hospitality, uniquely weight these three elements. We encourage you to reflect on your own recent service experiences in your daily life.
Think about your last hotel stay, your last flight, or even your last ride share. When you walked away feeling satisfied or frustrated, was it the explicit delivery, the implicit atmosphere, or the information flow that ultimately shaped your perception of the quality you received?
Thank you for joining us for this intellectual exchange. Until next time,